Well, you can tell today that we have a furry friend joining us. This is Ollie the dog, who is walking with me and Roger Hargreaves from the Glossop Heritage Trust. I always have to take a breath to say that, Roger, just to make sure I've got it right. GHT.
Yes.
It makes me always think of a popular hair straightener brand. GHD.
I wouldn't know about that. I'm not in the market for hair straighteners.
Anyway, welcome back to the podcast, and we've come further down the valley this time. We have parked just once where Crowden Train station was. We can see the railway cottages just up on the hill here, and the Woodhead Pass a little bit further over the other side of the water. We're where Torside Reservoir meets Woodhead Reservoir, and we are walking south side of Woodhead Reservoir. We're going to keep walking for maybe 15-20 minutes or so and turn around and come back. It's quite windy today, so when we turn a corner you may you may get a gust of wind, so forgive us for that. I've now got to navigate a massive puddle. Well, okay, Roger's taking the better route. I was going to go straight through the middle, but he's found stepping stones. Today we're going to talk about traffic. Not necessarily in the type of traffic you're thinking. Today, I suppose traffic is quite different, Roger, isn't it? In the form of trucks and cars, which not everybody is happy about, let's put it that way,
No.
Along Woodhead Pass. But this point where we are now, if we just kind of take a pause, so this is where Crowden Station was, which is nearer the water.
Yeah.
What can you kind of tell us about, Crowden Station? It was obviously on the Manchester to Sheffield line, but what do we know about Crowden Station?
Well, it was quite big in its final form. It was it had a central platform, and there were lines on both sides, and it would have been. At times would have been fairly busy here. There were quite a lot of weekend tourist traffic, day trippers coming to here or to Woodhead Station. The railway was here before the waterworks started, so it would have been very busy while the waterworks was going on. But I guess towards the end, we know from the accounts of people like John Davies who lived up here that it got a lot quieter.
Once all the work was done, I suppose.
Yes, and the day trippers moved elsewhere.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because one of the things I'm going to be doing for part of Longdendale Tales is on Saturdays we'll be recounting a story called A Picnic from Woodhead, which we're dividing into 4 parts of a bunch of travellers who get off the train at Hadfield train station, walk over the hill near to where we are, well, on the other side, go into the inn for a bit of a pause, and then happen to come back somehow to Crowden. So that will be on Saturdays. But yes, another account, I should say, of these day trippers. John Davies, you mentioned, lived in the railway cottages since, we think, 1912 when he was a boy. He helped renovate or build the porch, which is now on St James Chapel across the water.
That's right, yes.
He worked on the railway for maybe 50 years, and we've got some of the letters written to him to a local schoolboy, a transcript as well, which is recounting all of his stories of seeing the Longdendale lights and such. But I suppose the railway is what most people know about here, really, that the Longdendale Trail or the Trans-Pennine Trail that it's part of. That's what most people know about this particular section. But there's more than the railway, isn't there? I think you said on an email to me, this at one point was the M62 of the medieval ages, which intrigued me.
Yes, it's the valley has been a major transport route since prehistoric times. We found lots of flints from just below us at Torside, which show that there were lots of travellers through the valley even in prehistoric times.
And is that because flint wouldn't ever be from here? They've obviously come from somewhere else to bring it here.
Well, yes, they've come from somewhere else, but also it shows that there was a lot of there were lots of people moving through in order to leave it. the salt traffic probably goes back to prehistoric times. Salt, until the 18th century, salt was an absolutely vital commodity because farmers couldn't feed all their animals during winter. They had to slaughter a percentage of them in the autumn, and then they had to use salt. They used salt to preserve the meat for winter. So salt was absolutely crucial. And of course salt isn't available everywhere, it's only available in a few places. And the main source of salt in this part of the world was and still is from North Cheshire. So the salt had to be traded over relatively long distances, even going back into prehistory. People needed it. And this was one of several salt corridors between the Witches in Cheshire and Yorkshire.
Wow. So you mean the Witches like Northwich?
Northwich, Middlewich, Nantwich. Most of it here would have come from Northwich probably. The saltway ran down both sides of the valley, and we're more or less on the line of the south line of the saltway here, although the railway has obliterated most of the evidence. I've traced as much of it as I can.
And it's amazing really because, you know, to the ordinary eye, to me, there's a lot of grass, there's a lot of trees, there's a few rocks, but I think it's always interesting doing these projects to kind of then for you to delve into the history and you look a little bit closer and you start to see the markers and these paths, as you say.
Yes, it's there if you know what to look for. There's more remaining on the north side because the railway hasn't obliterated it.
How far back are we going? I mean, you say like medieval, but what about Romans?
There would have been salt traffic even in prehistoric times. There was certainly a lot of salt traffic in Roman times. It was very important to the Romans.
Wow!
And of course, they paid their soldiers partly in salt, hence salary.
Really?
The term salary comes from the practice of paying the soldiers partly in salt.
They were paid in salt.
Yes, so it was a valuable commodity. And it continued really until the early 18th century when farmers found ways of feeding all their stock during the winter. The salt wasn't as necessary for domestic use. It became possible to move salt by sea from the Witches, and so the salt trade effectively disappeared. But there would have been lots of other things carried as well besides salt. This would have been a major route for the wool trade in the later Middle Ages. Yeah,
I heard, like, you know, obviously along Woodhead Pass, when I've looked into the maps, say from 1840s, 1860s, 1870s, you can see that there were a number of pubs or inns along what is now Woodhead Pass. And I guess that's because if people were travelling by foot, they needed to stop every so often.
Oh, yes.
If anything, to kind of hide from the weather, I suppose.
Yes.
But the Miller's Arms at Salters Brook seems to be a particularly interesting point for a meeting of traffic because of it kind of across the borders where shepherds would meet and trade sheep, I understand.
Yes, well, they had the Miller's Arms. I think they had an annual gathering on open moorland. Sheep tend to wander.
Oh, so they bring them back.
And so every so often the farmers would gather the sheep together and sort out whose was whose.
I suppose a lot of people have heard about the Woodhead tunnels, and that has particularly interesting history, I suppose, from the building of it to the using of it. There were 3 tunnels in the end. There was the big restaurant there that I understand. There was a pub on top of the tunnels. What do we kind of know about some of that? I was trying to almost work out a bit of a timeline, I suppose, of what happened when, because it just seemed to be such a busy period, and then almost now you go there and there's nothing. Yeah.
Yes. Well, the first tunnel was started in 1837. Sorry, 1838.
Yeah.
It took 7 years to complete, and almost as soon as they'd finished building the first, they started on the second.
Yeah. I wonder what they built it with. You know, now they've got machines and technology. It must have been awful.
The way that they did it was to dig shafts down from the moor above, and then work from the bottom of the shafts. There were several shafts. So in addition to digging from either end, they dug from the centre, and they would have used gunpowder to blast the rock out. It probably explains a lot of the fatalities. It was
pretty dangerous.
It was very, very costly in terms of human life. Very dangerous. And it was the biggest project of its kind in the world at that time. It was the biggest and longest tunnel of its kind.
Did the people who were building the tunnels, did they live in a camp somewhere nearby?
Several camps.
Yeah.
There has been some research done on this. We don't know where they all were, but we can work out where some of them were. A lot of them would have lived on the top of the moor, near to the shafts, because that was where they were working.
Is it near where Woodhead Reservoir is?
And there would have been
now.
Yes,
towards Dunford Bridge. If you look on a map,
there would have been camps in the valley around Dunford Bridge, because that was the other end of the tunnel.
Yes.
So yes, they would have been scattered in various locations.
One of the things I was also reading about was how superstitious a lot of the navvies who were building the tunnels were. Many of them were Irish, and they used to kind of feel there was a sense of, I don't know, the place was slightly haunted. And I understand from some people who've got in contact with me who walk this area a lot, there are kind of, what do you call them? Not ghouls, goblins. The things you see on the side of churches, the scary faces.
Yes.
That kind of warn the demons away.
Yes.
And they kind of had all these superstitious kind of things they had around the area where they lived, because they felt that there was a sense of some kind of doom here, and I suppose also to hopefully ward away death for the dangerous work that they were doing.
Yes, I don't think it was particularly associated with the navvies. The stone head tradition probably goes back a long way before that.
Yeah.
Longdendale is basically the stone head capital of Derbyshire. We've found more of them here than anywhere else. They are what they are, and whether there's any connection between them is very difficult to. A great deal of uncertainty about it.
Yeah, I suppose they didn't have Google back in the day. Where we are now, to the left of us, the road starts to open out, and I mean, this place here looks so different in so many different times of year. You've got the moorlands, which are really rugged to the right hand side. They're brown, some of them have got a bit of heather on. They're pretty rugged, I suppose is the word. To the left, whilst the reservoir looks pretty full now for the Woodhead, there are certain times of year where it looks empty and bare and ugly, if I'm honest, dirty sand, brown, of so many different colours. And there are sometimes hundreds of gulls that sit on the bank here, aren't there? There's quite a few now.
Yes, Ollie could tell you about the gulls.
I bet.
Ornithology is his main interest.
But just over the way, we can see Pike Naze Farm, where a lady called Helen runs the show over there. And it's only just noticeable now, but if you drive the Woodhead Pass, you probably drive over and never know there's 9 Holes Bridge.
Yes.
And we can just about see the semicircles because the water's pretty full.
It's full.
I understand, and there's the turning for Holmfirth as well, which at the top of that was the Tolmash Inn. It was a sober temperance pub. Yes. I think over that way where the stream, I've been told there are some stonemason carvings along the stream there as well. But this particular area, I mean, there were more pubs in this place. There was the Angel, I think there was the Georgian Dragon.
Yes, the Angel was over. The old Angel was on the old road, which you can see above the white van. And then when the new road was built in the 1820s, the Angel moved down to quite close to where the water's edge now. I can just see the enclosure that was around the pub before it was demolished. I can just see that from here. But yes, that was quite a big pub on the new turnpike, on the 1820s turnpike.
For people who are not from this area and don't know the history, it's kind of quite mad to kind of look out here and think, wow, there was like all these people trading salt. There was several pubs that we would have been able to see here, day trippers coming on the railway. It's just like such a different place.
It would have been. It was throughout history. It's been a busy place. It's not been a cul-de-sac. It's not been lonely and remote. The Victorian Romantics portrayed it as such, but it wasn't like that at all. It couldn't have been. There were lots of people travelling through here and have been for thousands of years. And then in the 19th century, of course, there was the railway and then the waterworks, and it was all very busy for very long periods. In a way, it's quieter now, much quieter now than it has been, apart from the traffic.
This particular reservoir, Woodhead Reservoir, I found quite interesting to read about because it looked like it was the hardest reservoir for them to actually complete. I mean, it took 29 years to complete these sections.
Of course, they were all beginners in those days. They were doing things that nobody had ever done before. Frederick Bateman certainly had no experience of anything on this scale because nobody did.
Engineer, wasn't
he?
Yeah.
And he didn't get it right first time and had to build a second dam to reinforce the first. It was still an amazing achievement.
I think that that would be really surprising for most people who don't know about the fact that these reservoirs were built to help a rising cholera problem further down in the growing cotton towns for Manchester.
Exactly. They needed clean water, and so it was absolutely essential to the development of Manchester and the other towns along the line to get clean water. And of course, in order to make sure it was clean, they then had to more or less empty the rest of the landscape. They'd taken all the valuable farmland anyway, but they then more or less cleared the remaining farms and houses out of the valley because they were concerned about pollution. They didn't want too many people living within the reservoir enclosure because of the risk of infection. There were a lot more people here once upon a time. Woodhead in particular, over there was a fairly significant village, and this was the last.
This is
stop.
Behind Pykenay's
Woodhead the Woodhead village, basically. The George and Dragon pub was immediately opposite us here.
Just for the turning for Homefirth. I mean, now there's nothing. There's just trees. There's just fields.
But there would have been quite a number of people living here.
Crowden was also quite a reasonably big. Well, is it hamlet? Is that what they called it in the days? I mean, at one point, did I read there were 139 households, and once the reservoirs were kind of finished, that dropped down to something like 39 households.
Yes, something like that. Yes. The good farmland all disappeared, so the farmers were just left with the high ground. So that the farming community would have reduced anyway.
And do we know like who kind of owned the land back in the days?
Yes, on this side the land was all part of the Howard estate. But on the other side, on the Cheshire side, it was split between several landowners, although the biggest landowners were the Tolmashes, hence the Tolmash Arms, the pub. But there were other landowners as well. The Bretland family owned land further up, hence Bretland Edge, which is over there.
In fact, we'll turn around and walk back.
When am I going to get to the rabbits?
The Bretland family are interesting, aren't they? Because I looked up and they were one of the, I think it was Reginald Bretland was one of the people who donated for the upkeep of St James Chapel on the hill. And I found...
It wouldn't be this one because he died before this one was built.
But there is, I found, and this is where I thought you might be able to help me, I found in Mottram in Longdendale Church, much further down the valley obviously, there is a marble statue on a plinth of original Bretland.
Yep, that's him.
Right.
Yep, that's where he was buried.
Who is he? I don't really know much other than...
Well, the Bretland family lived in Hollingworth, although they did own land further up here. Sort of a local gentry family which got progressively richer during the 17th century. Reginald Bretland was a lawyer who practiced in London. He was a senior judge. He gave money not just to the chapel, but he also gave left money in his will for an improvement of the saltway.
Wow.
And I think that the chapel, the modern chapel, is probably in a way the consequence of his bequest, because he provided money for a causeway to be built from Hollins up to Saltersbrook.
So Hollins is just at the end of Rosewood Reservoir, I think.
Hollins is down there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Basically to try to improve the saltway, which was probably not. It would have been extremely muddy
I bet.
in typical Longdendale
on a day like
weather.
Today. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? Because on a previous episode I was talking about the Ethels Challenge, which is part of the campaign to protect rural England, and one of the Ethels that you can visit as part of that 95 Hills and Summit Challenge is Bretland Edge.
Yes.
So now if you do the Ethels, there is another little bit of information, and it does explain, because when I saw the marble statue which is in Mottram Church, he had a wig or very fancy long hair, looked like he was a prog rock kind of dude.
Yes.
And he had loads of books, so now I think it's because he's a lawyer.
Yeah.
It makes sense.
Yes.
Do you know, so the people who own the land then, would they have had tolls so then to take money as people pass through? How?
No.
Uh-huh.
No, that's why eventually it was necessary to build a turnpike in order to do just that.
What is a turnpike?
Well, basically a turnpike, it's a toll road. It's a road. The turnpikes were built by turnpike trusts, which were usually composed of the local gentry and business people, landowners, people who had an interest in improving the condition of the road because they would benefit from it. They would get powers through an Act of Parliament, which would then enable them to borrow money to improve the road, and then to erect toll gates.
It's like the M6 toll road of its time.
It's just a toll road.
When are we talking about then? What kind of time was this?
Well, the turnpike on the other side of the valley, the Manchester to Saltersbrook turnpike, was one of the earliest in this area, and the Act was passed in 1732.
Right. So way before the reservoirs, way before the railway.
Yes. At a time when the economy was still rural, basically. So they built the turnpike. The term turnpike refers to the rotating metal spike, which they placed on top of the gate to discourage horse riders from jumping it.
Oh right, I did not know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's the turnspike, hence turnpike.
Right.
So they were able to charge to levy tolls. That is, if they could actually get people to use the road rather than go round. There was a problem of rat running. This is a constant theme through the whole of turnpike history of the battle between the turnpike trustees who needed the money and the users of the road.
Well, where there's a need, there's a business demand, isn't there? Let's face it.
Yeah.
Even them.
One of the problems here was that they built a toll gate just north of Woodhead up on the moor.
What does that involve? Is that just basically someone on there 24/7 saying give us your money?
Yes.
Here's a bucket.
Yes, you have to have there would be a house, and the toll keeper would live in the house and would open the gate once the toll had been paid.
What if they didn't pay? So you just think, it must be a bit of a scary job, really.
It was a very scary job. Yes.
I think so.
Yes, it was a very high risk, especially if you were up on the moors at Woodhead. It was a very high risk job. And then during the the building of the railways and then the reservoirs, they had great difficulty getting the money out of the contractors, because of course the road was being used extremely heavily to carry all the stone and so on, and the contractors would do their best to find ways round, and so what they did was to create temporary toll houses. They built temporary toll houses at places where the contractors couldn't get round, to try to get some money.
So it's almost a war between the landowners and then the new kind of boys in town who were building. Wow.
Yes.
Yeah, I would love to see the accounts for the building of the reservoirs. I think that would be quite complicated for even HMRC to go through. Do we know who paid for that?
Manchester Corporation.
I mean, is that like a public body, or was it a set of like pretty much mill owners
No, it was Manchester City Council as
right.
it now is. Yes. It was,
I genuinely didn't really know what that meant, because corporation sounds like a commercial company, doesn't it, to most people?
No, we're talking about the City Council. Yes, it was owned by Manchester. All this land was owned by Manchester until North West Water came into being in the 1960s, 70s, early 70s, was it?
Yeah, of
but
course.
Now
United Utilities. Yeah.
Now United Utilities, but it's historically it's always been Manchester land since the 1840s.
I've got to ask you about some rumours that I've heard. So Robin Hood and Dick Turpin, apparently they passed through here. They were some of the traffic.
Yes.
Is this just a load of nonsense?
Yes.
Like, I mean, you know your stuff.
You could probably add Charles Dickens, Oliver Cromwell, Elizabeth I, Mary Queen of Scots.
Is this where the line is, where I've got folklore one side and I've got you, the actual historian, on the other side?
Yes. There's all these tales. We're constantly battling against all these tales, which were often told to people at primary school by teachers who should have known better.
Well, that's what history is, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's the problem, and then of course it becomes established fact.
Yeah.
Miss so and so said.
But you can say there's no particular evidence of such.
No.
That's a shame, though, isn't it?
Robin Hood was everywhere. It's yeah.
I mean, it's been fascinating to kind of walk with you, Roger, and just get a kind of greater understanding. I think every time I come here I notice something different, but you know, I've always kind of gazed over the other side and thought, what is that? And I will always now, as you pointed it out, you start to see the different paths and you start to think, is that the salt path? Oh, you know, it makes me eager to kind of step over the other side when it's a bit warmer and a bit sunnier and a bit you know, less windy, and go and trace that path myself.
Yes, the most interesting things are on the other side, in fact.
But it's not as flat.
It's more difficult to walk over there. But yes,
it.
When I lead walks, it's always on the other side.
So there we go. Well, we'll leave the sheep to maintain the salt path for us in the meantime, but hopefully you've enjoyed listening to this, and do get in touch if you have things to share. Have you also walked the salt path? Have you come and walked here? Have you any stories of memories in your family of Crowden Station, of this particular part of the Woodhead Reservoir? We'd love to hear from you. Have a great day. I'm off to go and get a cup of tea and warm up. Bye bye.